For 50 years, one man was the architect. He wasn't just the owner, he was the creator. He drew the blueprint for an entire universe, sketching larger-than-life titans from mere mortals. He was the voice in the headset, the puppet master pulling every string, the final boss in the game he himself had designed. His name was synonymous with the art form, Vince McMahon. To the world, he was the immovable object, the ultimate authority. His power wasn't just corporate, it was creative, it was emotional. He taught millions of people how to feel joy, how to feel rage, how to suspend their disbelief. The entire global enterprise was built in his image. He was the patriarch of a billion-dollar family, and the fans, whether they loved him or hated him, were a part of that family. This wasn't just a company. It was an empire, and an empire needs a king. The king, however, operated from a fortress of his own making. The rules, we assumed, were his to write and his to break. That was the character. That was the story. We all believed we were watching the show he produced for the cameras. We never imagined the real, hidden show that was happening just behind the curtain, in the shadows of the boardroom. We celebrated the creation, blind to the cost. We saw the spectacle, but we never saw the ledger. We never saw the silence he was buying. Imagine a man who builds a castle. Stone by stone, he erects the walls, digs the moat, and raises the banners. He is the castle. Every hallway, every secret passage, every throne room is an extension of his own mind. For decades, this was Vince McMahon. He wasn't just in the wrestling business, he was the wrestling business. He took a regional, smoke-filled carnival act and, through sheer force of will, transformed it into a global media juggernaut. He created the very language we use to talk about it. WrestleMania, Monday Night Raw, the Attitude Era. These were not just events. They were cultural moments he willed into existence. His legend was built on audacity. He bet on himself, again and again, and won. He faced down governments, rival billionaires, and internal mutiny. And through it all, he remained, the one constant in a world of variables. He was the filter through which every single idea had to pass. His approval was the only thing that mattered. This created a myth of infallibility, a sense of untouchable, almost divine power. He wasn't just the CEO, he was the deity of this world. The fans, the wrestlers, the employees, everyone existed within his gravity. He was the sun, and everyone else was just a planet in orbit. This absolute power was part of the appeal. It was his greatest strength. We watched him, this strutting, gravel-voiced caricature of a billionaire, and we believed in the myth. We believed he was bulletproof. But in reality, the fortress he had built wasn't just to keep rivals out, it was to keep his secrets in. The first report landed like a whisper in a hurricane. It came not from a wrestling newsletter, but from the one place the myth couldn't control. The Wall Street Journal. The words were sterile, corporate. Investigation. Board of Directors. Non-disclosure agreements. Hidden payments. At first, the wrestling world deflected. It's a business play, we said. It's a boardroom shuffle. It's just noise. It couldn't be real. Not this. The man who had survived steroids trials, who had crushed every competitor, who had publicly battled God himself, brought down by an accounting issue? It seemed impossible. The story felt wrong, like a misprint. Fans argued online, dismissing it, searching for an angle. Was this a work? Was this a new storyline to bring him back to television? The cognitive dissonance was deafening. The man we saw on TV was a monster, a tyrant, a hero, but he was always our monster. This was different. This wasn't a storyline. This wasn't bravado. These were quiet, cold, legal terms, millions of dollars, payments to former female employees, allegations of misconduct. The crack began to spread. The silence from the company was deafening. The man who always had a response, who always controlled the narrative, was suddenly quiet. The architect's fortress had been breached, and as the silence stretched, the horrible sinking realization began to set in. The myth was beginning to crumble, and the man behind the curtain was being exposed, not by a rival, but by his own hidden actions. The show had stopped. Then the unthinkable happened. He announced his retirement, not with a bang, but with a tweet, a simple, corporate, sterile tweet. The king was abdicating. That Friday on SmackDown, his music hit, the familiar, arrogant strut. He walked to the ring he had built, in the arena filled with fans who had paid to see his creation, and he said, nothing. He stood there, absorbed the cheers, adjusted his microphone, and uttered a few cryptic words. Then, now, forever, together. He dropped the mic and walked away. It was one of the most chilling, surreal, and unsettling moments in the history of the sport. It wasn't a farewell, it wasn't a defiance, it was hollow. It felt like a ghost haunting his own house. The commentators, usually so boisterous, had nothing to say. They were told to simply let it be. But that silence was louder than any explosion. It was the sound of an era ending without a period, just an ellipsis. Backstage, the atmosphere was one of profound shock. Not just sadness, but confusion, fear. The man who was the sun had just gone out. Who was in charge? What was the company without him? Wrestlers who had built their entire careers around his vision were suddenly adrift. It was a power vacuum. The king had left the castle, not in defeat, but in disgrace, and he hadn't even bothered to say goodbye. That short, hollow walk to the ring wasn't for the fans. It was for him. One last look, one last moment of control before the silence he had purchased finally, inevitably, consumed him. The throne was empty. For the first time in memory, someone else had to sit in it. His daughter, Stephanie McMahon, and his son-in-law, Triple H. The new regime took over. The mood shifted. Backstage, there was a palpable sense of relief, a breath of fresh air. Wrestlers who had been sidelined were suddenly given storylines. The promos felt less scripted, the matches felt longer, the sports aspect started to creep back into sports entertainment. It was clear that a new artist was painting on the canvas. But outside the castle, the storm raged. The media was relentless. This was no longer a wrestling story. It was a mainstream news story, a story of corporate malfeasance, power, and exploitation. The company's carefully crafted, family-friendly image was shattered. Sponsors were reportedly nervous. The stock, once a titan, was volatile. The WWE brand, Vince's life's work, was now intrinsically linked to the dark scandal he had created. The family, the ones left holding the pieces, had to navigate an impossible situation. They had to run the company, answer to shareholders, and manage the creative, all while processing the fact that their own father, their leader, was the source of the rot. Imagine trying to fix the castle walls while knowing the architect himself had poisoned the well. The new era had begun, but it was an era born from shame, one that had to constantly look over its shoulder, cleaning up a mess it didn't make, while the king watched in silent exile. This is where the story truly darkens. This is the moment the hug becomes the attack. The initial report was just the tip of the iceberg. As the investigation continued, the numbers grew. This wasn't one mistake. It wasn't a single lapse in judgment. It was a pattern, a system. More and more payments were uncovered, spanning years, even decades. Millions upon millions of dollars. The company's own money, allegedly miscategorized, used to buy the silence of women. This changed everything. It reframed his entire legacy. Every defiant promo, every no chance in hell strut, every moment of perceived genius. It was all now tainted by this dark, hidden ledger. This was the betrayal. The man who demanded loyalty above all else had betrayed the company he built, the shareholders he answered to, and the family who bore his name. The NDAs weren't just legal documents, They were stories that were never allowed to be told. They were voices that were silenced. The fans, the community, had to reckon with this. How do you cheer for the creation when you know the creator is so deeply flawed? It felt like finding out your favorite childhood hero was the villain all along. The story of Vince McMahon was no longer one of a self-made billionaire. It was a story of power, absolute, corrupting power, the power to create and the power to erase, the power to buy loyalty and the power to buy silence. The castle, it turned out, was filled with dungeons. Now think about the family. Think about Stephanie, who had spent her entire life defending her father, both on screen and off. She had been the public face of the company's empowerment initiatives, the Women's Revolution. She was the chief brand officer, the ambassador of the company's good. And now, she was co-CEO, forced to navigate the fallout of her own father's alleged misconduct against other women. The hypocrisy was staggering, the emotional weight unimaginable. Think about Triple H, the man who married into the family, the one positioned as the heir. He was finally getting his chance to implement his own vision, a vision many fans preferred. But he was only in this position because of the scandal. He was building on ruined foundations. Every creative success he had was juxtaposed against the failure of his father-in-law. It was a poisoned chalice. And what of Linda, his wife, who had built the company alongside him and run for public office? The political and personal humiliation. The family unit, which had been presented as the bedrock of the company, was fractured. They had to put on brave faces for the cameras, for the investors, for the employees. They had to be the shield, protecting the brand from the man who was the brand. The scandal wasn't just corporate. It was a deep, Shakespearean family tragedy. The loyalty they had always preached was now their heaviest burden. The empire was crumbling from within. The new era felt good. The product was stable. The backstage chaos had calmed. The fans were cautiously optimistic. It seemed the company had survived. And then the new year hit. The king returned. But he didn't return as a creative genius. He returned as a shareholder. In a stunning, ruthless display of power, Vince McMahon, still the majority stockholder, forced his way back onto the board of directors. He didn't ask. He demanded. He staged a corporate coup against his own company, his own family. The retirement had been a lie. It was a strategic retreat. The breath of fresh air the fans had been enjoying turned toxic. The dread was immediate. He was back. Wrestlers who had thrived under the new regime reportedly felt their stomachs drop. Was it all over? Was the creative freedom gone? The optimism that had just begun to bloom was crushed under the weight of his familiar, arrogant boot. Stephanie McMahon, the woman who had stepped up to save the company, resigned. The same day her father officially returned. The subtext was clear. She would not or could not work with him. The betrayal was complete. He had chosen power over his family. He had chosen the company over its own stability. This wasn't about wrestling anymore. It was about control. He had built the castle, and he would be damned if anyone, even his own children, would run it without him. He would rather see it sold to a stranger than governed by another. His return wasn't about running Monday Night Raw. It wasn't about storylines. He had a different endgame. The reason he forced his way back, the reason he staged the coup, was for one thing: to sell the company. He came back to facilitate a strategic alternative. And just like that, the empire was put on the auction block. The company that had been his life, his family's legacy for 3 generations, was for sale. The buyer emerged, Endeavor, the parent company of the UFC. A new entity was formed, TKO. The McMahon family's unilateral control, the very thing Vince had just fought to regain, was gone forever. He had sold his kingdom, the deal was finalized, and Vince McMahon, while still involved, was no longer the final say. He now had bosses. For the first time in his life, he answered to someone else. It was the ultimate, ironic end to his reign. The man who built an empire on the idea of control had to sell it to protect his own financial future and legacy from the very scandals he himself had created. He had consolidated his power one last time, not to rule, but to cash out. The dynasty was over. The fans, the wrestlers, the employees, they weren't part of a family business anymore. They were assets on a balance sheet for a massive media conglomerate. The architect had sold the keys to his castle. And so, the new era begins. The TKO era. Creatively, Triple H remains in charge. The shows continue. The storylines build. The fans, for the most part, are enjoying the product. It feels healthier. The shadow of the man in the headset, the one who would rip up scripts minutes before a show went live, is gone. There is a sense of long-term planning, a respect for the craft that feels fresh and liberating. The sport is back. But the king is still there. He's not in the throne room, but he's in the castle. His title is Executive Chairman. He's still pulling strings, still a presence. The sale wasn't an exorcism. It was a merger. The man and his myth are fused with the brand. And that's the strange, uncomfortable reality the new WWE lives in. It's a company trying to build a bright, new, positive future while still being tethered to the man responsible for its darkest chapter. The scandal isn't gone. It's just quiet. The payments were made. The NDAs are still in effect. The stories are still silenced. The new regime and the new owners have to carry that weight. They benefit from the empire he built, but they are also responsible for the ghosts he left in the hallways. The audience has to perform the same mental gymnastics, to love the art while acknowledging the artist's unforgivable flaws. It's a stained, complicated, and deeply compromised new dawn. The show goes on, but it will never, ever be the same. We began this story thinking the betrayal was the payments. We thought the shock was the retirement. We thought the twist was the sale. But we were wrong. The real story, the one that shakes the foundation of this entire world, isn't about the money. The money was just the tool. The real story is about the silence. The true scandal is about power. The kind of absolute power that allows one person to define reality for thousands and to allegedly erase the stories of those who got in his way. The payments weren't just hidden, they were a muzzle. They were a lock on a door, behind which truths are trapped forever. The core of the betrayal wasn't that the king fell. It's that he built his throne on a graveyard of silenced voices. This wasn't a Liv Morgan attacking Rhea moment, where one performer betrays another. This was different. In this story, the stage itself was the betrayal. The ring we all loved, the universe we escaped to, was, for some, a place of fear. The man who gave a voice to generations of superstars was the same man who allegedly paid to take voices away from others. The ultimate legacy of this scandal isn't the end of a dynasty. It's the horrifying realization that the realest, most important stories in the history of this company are the ones we will never, ever be allowed to hear.